Hi and welcome to our Tableau HyperAPI training. And in this one, we're going to be using Access as our data source, and we're going to be doing some data manipulation and then loading it into a Hyper database. Now I had to do this because I was having some problem with Tableau Prep trying to access the Access database and kept giving me an error saying that someone had the file open, and really Tableau was the only place with it open. So I was like, hey, instead of going through all this, why don't I just build my own ETL process, and this will just make my life 10 times easier, and plus I don't have to go in here and update or do anything. So in this tutorial, this is what we're going to show, and this is going to be the short version. If you want the extended version where we kind of go and we spend an hour going through step by step every single process that you're going to see in this video, I'm going to show you all the code. But if you want to know more in depth step by step, then I highly recommend you click on the link below in the description. It'll take you over to my site and where I have the long version of this, just because, you know, everything trends better on YouTube when it's shorter. So I'm going to walk you through quickly the architecture, then we're going to get in the code, I'm going to explain it, and that's what we'll have for today. So stay tuned. Okay, so here we have the 4 steps that we're going to go through. So we're going to create a virtual environment, then we're going to connect to both our Access database and then the Tableau Hyper database, or Hyper API, which is going to create the database that we want to. We're going to extract all the data from Access, and then we're going to load it into the Hyper file. So that's ultimately the structure in which we need to follow. There is the T for ETL, the transform phase. I didn't do much ETL, transformations in this particular process, so I didn't include that in here, but we do have some in the case file. So I'm going to show you that right now. We're going to walk through the code. All right, so here we are in Python, and so all this is running in the virtual environment already. We've already set that up, and what I'm going to do is just go through the packages and how I have it sectioned off, and you can see the tabs right here if you need to skip to those sections. So the first thing we're going to do is set up all of our packages in here. So I'm using the Tableau HyperAPI package, or module I should say, the datetime module, the PyODBC package, the Pandas package, and I'm using the list directory from this OS library right here. So I have all of these loaded, and that's going to be all the packages and modules that we're going to need in order to get this job running. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually access the Access database. So I'm going to load the drivers, and more importantly, the file path. Where is the files located? And then right here, we're going to iterate over the file, just because that folder can have multiple files in there. It's not going to always be clean. So this is just doing some checking and creating a list of files for us. Again, in the extended version of this tutorial, we walk through like what each step did while we use that. The next thing we're going to do is actually connect to Hyper, or set up the Hyper parameters, that's to say, before we actually connect to Hyper. So here we have the full the file path of where we want the database to actually be stored. We have the schema, and then we have the table name. So these are very important. You don't necessarily need to have a schema. It'll just default to public. But if you want to put your own schema, I use DBO because that's what SQL uses by default, but you can use whatever you want, honestly. And then here I have the tables and the columns defined in here, and this just makes it easy. So if I want to add another column, or someone's like, oh, we need this piece of data, I can go in here and I can add it in one place, and guess what? It's used throughout the whole file. I don't have to go and sit there and figure out where I'm adding columns to the Pandas data frame, and then why that column's not adding to the Hyper database. It creates too much of a hassle. You can add everything here and fix it all in one section, so that's why I highly recommend parameters. Next thing we're going to do is actually focus on the connection. So this is the connections phase, and the connections phase is going to create a Hyper instance process right here with Hyper process. So it's going to spin up an instance of the Hyper API. Secondly, you're going to create a connection to the database. In this case, we happen to be creating a database, and we gave it the name, which we passed inside the parameter section. And then we're going to define our table. So just like in SQL, when you need to create a schema, you need to create a table, and also put the data types in there, you're going to do the same exact thing here. And again, in the long version, we kind of break it down and we go through a little bit more in depth into everything. But all I did was label the columns right here. And you can see that I'm using the kind of array function of doing this. You don't have to do this. You can actually just name everything directly. So you can reference these column names, but this column 0 is referencing this list right here. But you can label this obviously a much better way, and I highly recommend that. This was just to be extendable. So if I do want to create a code where someone's like, hey, I want the same kind of project, they can create a list, and then I can write some code to say, like, check the first 9. You know, if they have 9 items here, then go up to first, 9, and then give it a data type and so on and so forth. So that's just for extendability in the future. And then the most important thing is, once you kind of create this entire table structure, none of this is actually published yet. This is just in memory. This is what creates it right here. So right here, it's going to actually create the schema into that database that we created, which happened right here. This is where we created the database, and we gave it that database path, which gives it a file name, which is right here. All right, and then it's going to create the table and the table definition, which is all that stuff that we put there. And the next phase we're going to do is going to be the extract. So this is where we connect to the Access database and we go and we extract all the data that we want out of there. And now we've already defined the columns because the Access database has multiple databases inside the folder. And then inside each one of those folders, there's like 30 different tables. So I was like, I don't want all these tables. I just want the ones that I want. So I actually define those up top in the parameters and I pass that in here, and it's going to loop over all the different files and all the different tables. So that's the really kind of goal part that you get into. And so we're just going to use pyodbc.connect to connect to it. We're going to write our select statement right here. So it's going to pull all the data from whichever table that we're referencing at that particular moment. Again, we're looping over multiple tables, and then it's just going to bring all these file names out. And this is just doing some error handling right here. This is where the actual real magic happens. So this is where it goes. It fetches all the rows, it appends it to a list, and then that list gets pushed up here. And then that's going to be loaded into a data frame once I have all of my data loaded. And then the last step is going to be just a little quick transformation. Actually, I shouldn't say last step. The second to last step is going to be a little bit of transformation. We had some empty dates, and the Hyper API does not like the null dates in there for some reason. So I just went ahead and used Microsoft Basic, January 1st, 1900. So I can go ahead and know when dummy data or when the data was missing, and I can just fill that in with that. And then we're also going to fill in this thing called the Ipa code. And normally this should be an integer, but for some reason it came as a float and was just causing problems. So if it was empty, just give me 0.0. And the most important part is just this last piece of code. So you do all that work and it really just gets down to this last bit. This bit right here where it's the inserter, and the inserter is just going to iterate over this data frame that we created, and then it's going to insert all the different rows, and then you call this execute method on the inserter, and it just loads everything into the Hyper data frame. And then in the end, what you're going to get is this file right here, which is going to be this weekly Ahan Pray, data report. And this is going to be the Hyper file. This now acts as a SQL server. So I no longer need a DBA to go ahead and do something for me or create a table for me. I can create my own tables and my own data sources, especially when they're external. Like if it's already existing, I'm not going to go ahead and do this process. But when you have data that's coming from FTP sites and things like that, then this is such a great alternative and it's much faster. And in the end, you can pull that in here. And in the tutorial, I was showing you how to actually just attach the file and everything. But you can see all the data came from the Excel file. And what I did, which was a bonus, was add these two columns over here. So I wanted to know which table it came from and which file it came from, because again, there were multiple files in there. So now I can see which file it came from, and you can see the year changes. And then also we have different tables in which the data came from. So it also pulls that in there. So if we need to reference it back or someone needs to know where this came from, then that is added. And so it's just actually pulling the file names and the table names directly from Access. They're not loaded in a column. It's actually pulling it from the file directory and loading it in here. So that is all that we have. If you want the full version of this, you can click on the link below. It'll take you over to my site where you can watch the full 1 hour training for free. There's no paid anything, and you can go in there and you can truly learn how to build out the Hyper API and also how to program in Python if this is your first time using an API. So till then, I'll see you in the next training.